Well, hey guys, we're going to look in Acts chapter 23 today. Paul is in his first, I guess you could call it a real trial. It's not a very good trial, but it's an actual trial instead of just rioting and nonsense being thrown around. And so we're going to look at the beginning part of this. I'll just read starting in verse 1 of chapter 23. It says, looking intently at the council, pardon me, I got something in my throat. I think it's better now. So they call him to the council to meet at the end of chapter 22. The council is going to be this Roman tribune, official person is going to kind of preside over it. The council is this group of Jewish elders and leaders, the Sanhedrin sorts of people, and then Paul. And they're accusing Paul of a bunch of things that aren't really true, so that they're going to get to the bottom of it. Okay? So looking intently at the council, verse 1, chapter 23, Paul said, brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up unto this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. And then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law you order me to be struck? Those who stood by said, would you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. I'm going to stop there. That's just the first 5 verses. What happens next, we'll look at tomorrow. It's total chaos what happens next. I mean, these guys, they don't know how to hold a legitimate court hearing. They just don't. They didn't know how to do it when Jesus was on trial. They didn't know how to do it for Stephen. They didn't know how to do it for Paul. Like, they're just corrupt, and it's a messed up place. So Paul, opening statement, he says, I have lived my whole life in good conscience before God to this day. That's his opening statement, okay? I kind of wonder about that because Paul oversaw the killing and the jailing of Christians, and he says, I lived my life in good conscience before God until this day. I think what he meant was, even when I was out there hunting Christians, I thought I was doing it for God. My conscience felt clean about it. I'm not quite sure what to make of that, other than he always said he was zealous for God. We looked at that, I think, yesterday or the day before. He says it in the book of Philippians as well. He was zealous for God. It was a zeal for God that motivated him, even though it was evil and it was sin. So anyway, he says it. That's his conscience. Who am I to argue about it? He says, I have lived my life before God with good conscience unto this day. Okay? Maybe he is talking about since his conversion to this day. Maybe. I don't know. You're welcome to speculate yourself. In any case, the reaction here is kind of crazy. So the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Like, that's not part of he's in the middle of a sentence here, guys. You're in a court. You don't just get to go punch the witness in the face. But that's what the high priest tells him to. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Anyway, Paul responded. It doesn't say they actually did strike him either. I'm not sure what actually happened. If somebody actually did punch him in the mouth, it says he ordered those who stood by him. Those who stood by him, meaning more than one person, like just jump on the guy, beat him or something. But I don't know if it actually happened because Paul's mouth still works. He says, strike him on the mouth. And Paul said to him, verse 3, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law you ordered me to be struck? So Paul lets it. Paul knows his law. He knows his Leviticus and Deuteronomy and all this. He knows it. He knows it as well as the high priest does, maybe better. Anyway, he says, look, you're ordering me to be struck. Like, that's not, what's this about, buddy? And Paul's right, okay? He calls him a whitewashed wall. That's a wall that gets dirty, and they would just paint white paint over it. Meaning you're dirty and you're hiding behind a clean coat of paint, but inside you're dirty. Jesus called the Pharisees this. He says, you're like whitewashed tombs. Outwardly you look great, but inside you're full of nothing but dead men's bones. Okay, same idea. You're covering up a lot of corruption that's inside you. You're covering it up to look nice. Verse 4, those who stood by said, would you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I didn't know, brothers, that he was the high priest, for it's written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. So Paul, even though he just, like, this guy is trying to get him beaten up and stuff, he's like, I didn't realize he was a high priest. And he quotes scripture, like, you shouldn't speak evil of a ruler of the people. So Paul is humble enough, even though this is a very heated moment, obviously very heated moment. The guy orders them to beat up Paul. Paul fires right back. You whitewashed wall, God's going to strike you. It's a very heated moment, and they say, look, that's the high priest. And I didn't know that. He backs off. He calms down. So good for him. I think we looked yesterday at Paul is the only one in the room, and the only one in the middle of the riot who's the voice of reason. Because when you're spirit-led, you don't have to give in to fear. You don't have to go into panic. You rejoice in the truth, so you're not going to run around spreading craziness. And so Paul, even in this heated moment, immediately calms down and says, "Hey, I didn't know." So I want to notice just a few things with this. Number one, sometimes you're probably going to get into a heated moment here and there. Somebody's going to, beat you up or whatever, and you need to keep that self-control, that fruit of the Spirit, even. You need to remain faithful to the Lord. Remember that God is in the room, that God is there, that it doesn't matter who else is there, what else they're saying. It's far more important. Your only audience is God, right? So that's part of it. But I want to look there. There's some other stuff in here. There's something interesting. Verse 4, those who stood by him said, would you revile God's high priest? Because Paul just called him a whitewashed wall and stuff. Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he's a high priest. All right? It might not be anything, but I think it's noteworthy. They say that this Ananias guy, would you revile God's high priest? Paul responds, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest. He is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. They call him God's high priest. Paul just calls him the high priest and refers to him as a ruler of the people. Now, maybe I'm reading into this, I don't know, but I think there's something to it either way. God's high priest is Jesus. Jesus is God, like literally, Jesus is the one that goes between humankind and God, not anybody else. Okay, and just to make that point clear, the day Jesus died, that curtain in the temple ripped from top to bottom. You don't need to be a priest to go in and out now. It's open now. Jesus is that high priest. The priest offers sacrifices. Jesus offered a sacrifice. He offered himself. Jesus is the high priest. So Paul specifically doesn't call him God's high priest, even though that's the title that this Ananias is going by and what his people are calling him. You're not God's high priest. You might be the people's high priest, but you're not God's high priest. And as much authority as the guy has, and Paul does seem to respect that authority. I didn't know that he was the high priest. I'm going to back off. I'm going to stop running my mouth and firing back. Even though he recognizes that authority, no, I'm not going to call him God's high priest. I'll call him the high priest, but I'm not going to call him God's high priest. There is a distinction here. And whether that's intentional or whether Paul's just, speaking off the cuff conversationally, the point is still the same. God's high priest is Jesus, and that he's the only one we need. We don't need this Ananias guy. Now, number two, this Ananias priest is a bad guy. Okay? You wouldn't know a whole lot about him getting into chapter 23. He has not come up yet. There's a couple other guys named Ananias in the book of Acts. It's not the same guy. Okay? It must have just been a common name or something. So this guy, the first thing we find out about him, if you only read Acts, you would say, well, he's kind of reactionary. We're in the middle of a court, and he orders some people to go beat up Paul right in the middle of it after his opening statement, or maybe in the middle of his opening statement, doesn't even let him finish. So he's violent. He's got henchmen. He's got hired goons that, hey, go beat that guy up, and they're on standby to do that. If you only read this, you would kind of get the impression, hey, this guy's a little bit dirty or something. But beyond that, if you keep reading, and we'll get there, partway, we'll get there tomorrow or the next day or something. But there's this group of them. Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they killed Paul. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, we've strictly bound ourselves. And they report to the chief priests and elders. So either this Ananias guy is part of the gang that wants to kill Paul, or he's the guy that the gang reports to. Okay, well, we can look at that tomorrow or the next day. But there is some serious criminal, evil, dirty, murderous intent here. And Ananias is the high priest, and he is either part of it or maybe the ringleader of it. But he's absolutely part of it. And that's who he is. So Paul is right. Whether he's supposed to insult the guy or whether he's in the right to say this, he is absolutely right to call Ananias a whitewashed wall who God will strike. Okay? God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law you order me to be struck? Listen, buddy, you're off the rails. You're going to sit here in some courtroom and condemn me to being punched? That's like some kind of punishment in a courtroom. I mean, if it happens in a courtroom, that's right. So you're going against the law, and you're sitting here trying to be the law enforcer, and you're against the law. God will strike you. Well, that actually happens. This Ananias guy was appointed. He was corrupt. You can look into the history. He was appointed probably relatively shortly before this event, 48 A.D., he was appointed by Herod, and he's high priest. He's not God's high priest. Jesus is God's high priest. But number two, he's like Herod's high priest. He's Rome's high priest. He's a puppet high priest who is put there, and he plays into their hands, and he is corrupt. And there's other historic records of this guy being corrupt, being violent, being out of control. And when the Romans came in to attack Jerusalem in 66 A.D., 66 to 70, you might know some history, not long after this, it's less than 20 years after this, a bunch of Jewish people from Jerusalem went in and killed Ananias, the high priest, because he was so corrupt he had sold out Jerusalem to the Romans, the incoming Roman army, to put down Jerusalem, to knock it and burn it to the ground, not one stone left on another kind of stuff. And they did. They destroyed it. But Ananias, who was their puppet leader, who he thought he was on their team, he didn't survive it. He was assassinated. He was a dirty and corrupt guy who eventually got what was coming to him. And so whatever Paul's doing here, whether Paul's just kind of snapping and it's a heated moment, or whether Paul is making a direct prophecy, it came true, what Paul says. God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. He's calling Ananias to account. And no, it doesn't happen the very next day or anything, but it does happen. It comes true. Ananias is corrupt. Paul saw straight through it. In 2 seconds of interaction, he sees straight through this guy and calls him out on it. And sure, it's a heated moment. He didn't even know he's a high priest. He has to kind of back off from it. But he's right on the money. And he's not God's high priest. They can call him that all they want, but he's not. He is just, he is in the position of high priest, but he's not appointed by God. It's appointed by Herod, and it's appointed by the corrupt, you could call it the deep state or the swamp or whatever. But this guy is a corrupt, bad guy, and he's made his way all the way to the top, and it eventually comes back and gets him. So anyway, what you can get out of that personally, like how to apply that stuff, it's kind of historical anecdotes, it's stuff like that, but I don't tell you that stuff just to educate you. I think it's important. Your sins will find you out. God sees straight through them. God is not impressed. People can call you any name they want. They can raise you to the top of your organization and say that you're God's high priest and everything else, and guess what? You're not. and God sees through it. So let's be people who are purely devoted to God from the inside out. And if we wind up in positions of leadership and authority, let's not let that turn into pride. Let's not lord it over people. Let's not use that for our personal gain or to settle scores or something like this Ananias guy does. Let's just remain purely dedicated and centered on the Lord. If you're in a position where you encounter somebody like this, I think it's wise to bite your tongue, and Paul has to backtrack here. There's a time for calling out judgment. There's a time for speaking the truth, and Paul does that. But he also, when he's realized, hey, this is the high priest you're talking to, he recognizes he needs to speak a little bit more respectfully. He's going to respect the office of high priest, even if the priest himself, the person, is completely contemptible. So that's kind of a fine line to walk, and you may not, hopefully you don't find yourself in a position like that where you're having to report up to somebody who is positionally above you, but who is morally corrupt or something. Hopefully you're never in that position, but it's a very delicate position to be in, and you can see Paul kind of struggling to handle that the right way. And we'll see tomorrow. It's not over. They go into it from here. Paul is able to use their internal corruption to get them to throw themselves under the bus, so he doesn't really have to. Anyhow, what I get out from this is don't be a whitewashed wall. Don't just cover over your sin. Actually be made new by Christ, so you don't have to cover your sin. He covers your sin. He makes you new. You're not a whitewashed wall. You're a new wall. You're just a new person, okay? And that is probably the most applicable thing here. And watch your tongue. If you're somebody who is prone to speaking out, who's prone to getting caught up in your words and getting heated and stuff like that, quick to speak, quick to snap things. This is a tendency I see in myself, that I'm a talker, and that can get me in trouble. It can be good. The good things can come, but it can get me in trouble too. So be careful. Be careful with your words. But at the same time, Paul was right. I'm not sure it was sin when he did this, but he does have to backtrack. And so be careful. Be pure, speak respectfully to one another, and also speak the truth. Praise the Lord. I'll talk to you tomorrow right at noon. We do these every day. We'll continue in this and see some more. This court system, so-called court system in Jerusalem, is so corrupt. I mean, by this time, after killing Jesus, after a couple, maybe 2 decades since then, since Jesus had died, it is just a dirty, corrupt, bad system. It has gotten bad, and we'll see some more of that corruption here tomorrow. God bless you. I'll see you then.